She fed the captives before herself. The Apache called her a leader. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Sonoran desert when Sarah Mackenzie first heard the thunder of hoofbeats that would change her life forever. She was hanging laundry behind the small adobe house she shared with her husband Tom, the dry Arizona wind whipping the cotton sheets like flags of surrender. The year was 1884, and life on the edge of Apache territory had always carried the weight of uncertainty. But that morning felt different, heavier somehow, as if the very air held its breath. Tom had ridden out before dawn to check the cattle near Willow Creek, leaving Sarah with their usual morning routine. She hummed softly as she worked, a hymn her mother had taught her back in Missouri, before the promise of land and a new life had drawn them west. The melody drifted across the sparse landscape, mixing with the distant call of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. The first arrow struck the wooden post beside her, with a sound like breaking bone. Sarah's hands froze on the wet fabric, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. She turned slowly, knowing with terrible certainty what she would see. 7 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, silhouetted against the morning sky, like something carved from the desert itself. Their faces were painted for war, and their eyes held the hard gleam of men who had lost too much to feel. "Pity, please," Sarah whispered, though she knew they likely couldn't understand her English. "My husband, he's not here. I'm alone." The leader, a man whose weathered face spoke of countless battles, dismounted with fluid grace. He wore no feathers or elaborate dress, just practical buckskin and moccasins that made no sound as he approached. When he spoke, his English was better than she'd expected, colored with an accent that made each word deliberate and careful. "We know where your husband rides," he said. "We know many things about you, woman who sings to cloth." The name startled her. They had been watching, listening to her morning songs. "You will come." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, each one ending in the same inevitable conclusion. She could run, but there was nowhere to go in this vast expanse of desert and stone. She could scream, but the nearest neighbors were miles away. She could fight, but what weapons did she have? Against 7 armed warriors? Instead, she did something that surprised even herself. She nodded. "May I gather some things?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The leader studied her for a long moment, as if measuring something invisible. "You have the time it takes. The sun to move the width of my hand," he said, holding up his palm against the sky. Sarah moved quickly but deliberately through her small home, gathering not luxuries but necessities. A small knife, her mother's Bible, a pouch of salt, and the blanket Tom's grandmother had woven. As she packed, she could hear the warriors speaking softly in their own language outside, their words flowing like water over stone. When she emerged, one of the younger warriors had already taken her horse from the small corral. The leader gestured for her to mount, and she did so without argument. As they rode away from the only home she'd known in Arizona, Sarah turned back once to see the laundry still hanging on the line, the white sheets now looking less like surrender and more like ghosts waving goodbye. The journey into the Chiricahua Mountains took most of the day. They rode through landscapes that seemed carved by gods, towering red rocks that thrust into the sky like ancient fingers, canyons that dropped away into purple shadows, and mesas that stretched endlessly toward horizons shimmering with heat. The Apache rode with an easy familiarity through this terrain, following paths invisible to her eyes, moving through country that would have killed her within days if she'd tried to cross it alone. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, they finally stopped. The camp was larger than Sarah had expected. Not just warriors, but women, children, and elders. Dogs barked at their approach, and children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts with curious eyes. Cooking fires sent thin streams of smoke into the evening air, carrying the scent of roasting meat and corn. The leader dismounted and spoke briefly with an elderly woman whose presence commanded immediate respect. Her hair was white as winter, braided with silver ornaments, and her dark eyes held depths that seemed to encompass decades of wisdom and sorrow. When she looked at Sarah, it was with neither hatred nor pity, but with something more unsettling, kind of patient evaluation, as if she were looking at a seed and wondering what it might grow into. "You will stay with the other captives," the leader told Sarah. "You will work, you will not try to run. The desert kills those who do not belong to it, and we will not chase ghosts." He gestured toward a group of people sitting near the edge of the camp. 3 other white captives, all women, all bearing the hollow-eyed look of those who had seen their old lives burned away. Sarah was pushed gently but firmly in their direction, and as she walked across the packed earth of the camp, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, measuring, judging, deciding what kind of person she might prove to be. That night, as she lay wrapped in her grandmother's blanket under a canopy of stars more brilliant than any she'd ever seen, Sarah Mackenzie made a decision that would define everything that followed. She would not merely survive this captivity. She would find a way to live within it with dignity, compassion, and grace. She had no idea that this choice would transform not only her own fate, but the very meaning of leadership itself in the harsh beauty of Apache country. Sarah's first week among the Apache taught her that survival was measured not in days, but in heartbeats. Not in comfort, but in the simple act of drawing breath in the thin mountain air. The other captives, Mary, a widow from Tucson, Elena, a young Mexican woman taken from a border settlement, and Catherine, barely 16 and still calling for her mother in her sleep, had formed their own small society of shared misery and whispered fears. The work was constant and unforgiving. Sarah's hands, once soft from her domestic life, quickly developed calluses from grinding corn, scraping hides, and gathering the endless supply of wood needed to keep the fires burning. The Apache women watched her with expressions that ranged from mild curiosity to open contempt, but they rarely spoke to her directly. Communication came through gestures, demonstrations, and the occasional sharp word when she moved too slowly or performed a task incorrectly. It was during the second week that Sarah first noticed the hunger. The Apache, she realized, were not the savage raiders of frontier legend, living in abundance off stolen cattle and plunder. They were a people pushed to the margins of survival, their traditional hunting grounds carved up by cattle ranches and mining claims, their water sources claimed by settlers who had never learned to read the subtle language of the desert. The rations distributed each evening were carefully measured, enough to sustain life, but barely enough to satisfy the gnawing emptiness that had become Sarah's constant companion. The captives received even less. "They're trying to starve us into submission," Mary whispered one evening as they shared their meager portion of acorn cakes and dried meat. Her voice carried the bitter edge of a woman who had buried 2 children and learned that life rarely offered second chances. "Make us so weak we can't even think about running." Elena, whose Spanish-accented English painted her words with musical cadences, shook her head. "No, they feed their own people just barely more. Look at the children. You can see their ribs. This is not cruelty. This is, how do you say, necessity." Catherine said nothing, but Sarah noticed how the girl's dress hung loose around her shoulders, how her eyes seemed to have grown larger in her thinning face. At 16, she should have been blooming into womanhood, but instead she was withering like a flower in drought. That night, as Sarah lay listening to the familiar sounds of the camp settling into sleep, the soft conversations in Apache, the occasional cry of a baby, the distant howl of coyotes in the mountains, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. When the morning rations were distributed, she would find a way to share hers with the other captives. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The next morning brought news that a hunting party had returned empty-handed from a 3-day expedition into the high country. The disappointment was visible in the slumped shoulders of the warriors, the worried conferences among the elders, the way mothers held their children a little closer. When the food was distributed, the portions were even smaller than usual. Sarah took her allocation, a piece of cornbread no larger than her palm and a strip of jerky so thin it was almost translucent, and walked to where the other captives sat in their designated area. Without ceremony, she broke the cornbread into 4 pieces and divided the jerky with her small knife. "What are you doing?" Mary hissed, even as her hand reached instinctively for the offered food. "You need that. We all need every scrap we can. Get." "We need to stay alive," Sarah replied quietly. "But we also need to stay human. If we become animals fighting over scraps, what's the point of surviving?" Elena's eyes filled with tears as she accepted her portion. "Gracias, hermana," she whispered. "My grandmother used to say that sharing hunger makes it smaller." Catherine took her piece without speaking, but the look she gave Sarah held more gratitude than words could carry. The act did not go unnoticed. Sarah became aware of eyes upon her, not just the other captives, but some of the Apache women as, well, she caught fragments of conversations in their language, heard her name or what they had taken to calling her, mentioned in discussions that seemed to carry weight beyond mere gossip. The elderly woman who had first examined her, whom the others called Grandmother Willow, began to watch her with particular interest. Sometimes Sarah would look up from her work to find those ancient eyes studying her, as if reading something written in a language Sarah herself didn't understand. The sharing became a daily ritual. No matter how small her portion, Sarah divided it among the 4 captives. On days when the hunting was good, the gesture meant little. On days when the camp went hungry, it meant everything. She watched as Elena began to regain some of her strength, as Catherine's hollow cheeks filled out slightly, as Mary's bitter edge softened into something approaching hope. But she also watched herself grow thinner. "You're killing yourself," Mary said one evening after a particularly meager distribution. Sarah had given away her entire portion that day when she noticed Catherine swaying on her feet during wood gathering. "This nobility of yours, it's just another form of suicide." Sarah looked out at the camp, at the Apache families sharing their own small meals, at children who played despite their hunger, at warriors who maintained their dignity even as their bodies grew lean from want. "Maybe," she said softly, "or maybe it's the only way to truly live." That night, as she lay wrapped in her blanket feeling the sharp edges of hunger cutting at her stomach, Sarah heard footsteps approaching. She opened her eyes to see a small figure silhouetted against the dying embers of the nearest fire. It was one of the Apache children, a girl of perhaps 8 years, carrying something wrapped in cloth. The child knelt beside Sarah and unwrapped a small piece of roasted rabbit. Still warm from the fire, she placed it gently beside Sarah's blanket, whispered something in Apache that sounded like a blessing, and disappeared back into the shadows. Sarah stared at the gift for a long moment, understanding that something had shifted in the careful balance of the camp. Her actions had been noticed, evaluated, and in this small but significant way, approved. She ate the rabbit slowly, savoring not just the rich meat but the profound gesture of recognition it represented. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new hunger, new tests of character. But tonight, under the brilliant canopy of desert stars, Sarah Mackenzie understood that leadership was not about commanding others. It was about choosing to act with compassion, even when compassion seemed impossible, and discovering that such choices could echo in ways she never expected. The drought came with the killing heat of late summer, turning the already harsh landscape into something that seemed actively hostile to life. The mountain streams that had provided the camp's water dwindled to muddy trickles, then to damp patches of earth that had to be dug out with careful hands. The hunting became even more desperate as game moved deeper into the high country, following water sources that hadn't yet failed. Sarah had been with the Apache for 2 months when the first child died. Little Hawk, barely 3 years old, had been sick for days with a fever that wouldn't break. His mother, a young woman named Swiftwater, had spent sleepless nights holding him, singing the ancient songs meant to call his spirit back from the Shadowlands. But on a morning when the sun rose like a copper coin through the haze of distant fires, the child's breathing simply stopped. The keening that rose from Swiftwater's throat was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard. A sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, raw and primal and filled with a grief that transcended language. It was answered by other voices throughout the camp, women and men alike joining in a chorus of mourning that made the very air seem to vibrate with loss. Sarah found herself crying, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She didn't know why this particular death affected her so deeply. She had seen death before, had lost her own infant son back in Missouri, but something about the communal nature of the grief, the way the entire camp shared in swift waters, pain broke something open inside her chest. That evening, as the burial preparations continued, the already small food rations were cut again. The logic was brutal but practical. With water scarce and hunting poor, every mouth was a liability. The captives' portions were reduced to almost nothing, a few mouthfuls of corn mush and whatever edible plants they could gather from the increasingly barren landscape. Sarah looked at her allocation, perhaps 3 spoonfuls of thin porridge, and then at her fellow captives. Catherine was barely staying upright during work details, her young body consuming itself in the absence of adequate nutrition. Elena had developed a persistent cough that echoed the sound of death Little Hawk had made in his final days. Even Mary, tough as desert hardpan, was showing the effects of prolonged hunger in the tremor of her hands and the way she had to pause frequently to catch her breath. Without hesitation, Sarah divided her meager portion among them and took nothing. For herself. "Sarah, no," Elena protested weakly. "You haven't eaten since yesterday." "I'll find something," Sarah lied, knowing that the gathering grounds had been picked clean and that her knowledge of desert edibles was still dangerously limited. "Eat." She walked away before they could argue further, moving toward the edge of the camp where she often went to escape the weight of watching eyes. But tonight, those eyes followed her. She could feel the attention of the Apache women, the way conversations paused as she passed, the subtle shift in the camp's energy that told her something was being discussed in the rapid, liquid syllables of their language. Grandmother Willow intercepted her before she reached the perimeter. The old woman appeared without warning, stepping out from behind a cluster of desert broom, as if she had materialized from the gathering darkness. Up close, Sarah could see the intricate tattoos that marked the corners of her eyes, the silver ornaments woven into her hair, the way her weathered hands moved with precise, economical gestures that suggested a lifetime of making every motion. "Count. Sit," Grandmother Willow said in English, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Sarah sat on a flat boulder, her empty stomach cramping with hunger, but her mind sharp with curiosity. In all her time in the camp, this was the first time one of the Apache elders had spoken to her directly. Grandmother Willow studied her for several minutes in silence, as if reading something written in the set of Sarah's shoulders. The way she held her hands, the steadiness of her gaze despite her obvious exhaustion. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and deliberate. "You give your food to the others," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Sarah replied simply. "Why?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Sarah considered lying, offering some explanation that might sound noble or strategic, but something about the old woman's gaze demanded absolute honesty. "Because they need it more than I do," she said. "Because watching people suffer when you can help, even a little, makes you less than human." Grandmother Willow nodded slowly, as if this answer confirmed something she had suspected. "Among my people," she said, "we have a word. Bikeko. It means, according to his way. It speaks of someone who acts from their deepest nature, not from what others expect or demand." She paused, letting the desert wind carry the scent of sage and wood smoke between them. "You act Bikego." "I don't understand," Sarah said. "You will." The old woman reached into a leather pouch at her waist and withdrew something wrapped in corn husks. She placed it in Sarah's hands. It was warm and smelled of roasted seeds and honey. A true leader does not command followers. A true leader creates them by example. With that, she disappeared back into the shadows as silently as she had come, leaving Sarah alone with the gift and a confusion of thoughts. She unwrapped the corn husks to find a small cake made from pine nuts and wild honey, rich with calories, and more precious than gold in their current circumstances. Her mouth flooded with saliva at the scent, and her empty stomach clenched with desperate need. But even as her hands shook with hunger, Sarah found herself breaking the cake into portions. Returned to find her fellow captives huddled together for warmth as the desert night descended with its characteristic swift chill. Without speaking, she distributed the pieces of the cake, keeping only the smallest portion for herself. "Where did this come from?" Mary asked, her voice thick with emotion as she savored the unexpected sweetness. "A gift," Sarah said softly, not mentioning from whom. As they ate in grateful silence, Sarah became aware that they were being watched, not with the hostile surveillance of guards monitoring prisoners, but with something else, a kind of respectful attention that she had seen directed toward the warriors when they returned from successful hunts, toward the medicine woman when she worked her healing arts, toward Grandmother Willow when she spoke in council. The next morning brought a subtle but unmistakable change in the camp's dynamics. When Sarah went to collect water from the diminished spring, one of the Apache women, Morning Star, who had previously ignored her entirely, showed her a more efficient way to strain the muddy liquid through layers of cloth. When she struggled with the unfamiliar technique of preparing cactus pads for eating, another woman demonstrated the proper way to remove the spines without wasting the precious flesh beneath. Most significantly, when the evening rations were distributed, Sarah noticed that her portion had grown slightly larger than those of the other captives. Not much, perhaps an extra mouthful of corn mush, an additional strip of dried meat, but enough to matter in a place where every calorie was measured against survival. She understood that she was being tested, that her actions were being weighed against some internal scale of Apache values that she was only beginning to comprehend. The extra food was not charity, it was recognition. Recognition that her choices had meaning beyond her own survival, that her willingness to sacrifice for others had marked her as someone worthy of investment. That night, as she divided her larger portion among the captives as she always did, Sarah felt the weight of watching eyes once again. But this time the attention carried something new, not just curiosity or evaluation, but the first stirrings of what might eventually become respect. In the distance, Swiftwater was singing a lullaby to her dead son's memory, her voice carrying across the camp like a thread of silver in the darkness. Sarah found herself humming along with the melody, not understanding the words but feeling their meaning in her bones. They were songs of loss and endurance, of finding strength in shared sorrow, of the way love persists even when its object has passed beyond reach. As she fell asleep under the desert stars, Sarah Mackenzie began to understand that leadership among the Apache was not about commanding from a position of strength, but about demonstrating grace under the weight of impossible choices. And in the morning, she would wake to discover that this understanding was about to be tested in ways she could never have imagined. The war party returned on a morning when the sun rose blood-red through smoke from distant fires, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with news that would shake the foundations of camp life. Sarah was grinding mesquite pods when she heard the hoofbeats, the urgent voices calling out in Apache, the way all work stopped as people gathered to hear what the scouts had learned. The leader of her original captors, Fierce Wolf, she had learned his name, dismounted with the careful movements of a man carrying wounds. His left arm hung stiffly at his side, and dark stains marked his buckskin shirt. But it was his expression that told the real story, the tight lines around his eyes, the way his jaw was set as if he were biting back words too bitter to speak. Grandmother. Willow emerged from her dwelling, moving with the swift purpose of someone half her age. The two spoke rapidly in Apache, their words sharp with urgency. Sarah caught fragments, place names she recognized, references to blue coats that meant cavalry, numbers that made the old woman's face darken with concern. Within hours, the camp was in motion, the Apache packed with the efficiency of people who had moved many times before, breaking down their lives into portable bundles with practiced ease. Sarah and the other captives were given their own tasks, rolling blankets, gathering cooking implements, helping load the reluctant mules that would carry supplies too heavy for human backs. As they worked, Elena managed to move close enough to Sarah to whisper, "What do you think is happening?" "Trouble," Sarah replied, watching the way weapons were being checked and redistributed, the way the warriors conferred in tight groups, the kind that makes people move quickly. The answer came that evening when they made camp in a hidden canyon, 20 miles from their previous location. Fierce Wolf stood before the assembled group, his wounded arm now properly bound but his face still carrying the weight of bad news. "The army has found our old camp," he announced, first in Apache, then in broken English for the benefit of the captives. "They follow our trail, many soldiers. They have Apache scouts with them." A murmur ran through the group like wind through dry grass. Apache scouts meant that their pursuers understood the terrain, could read sign the way white soldiers never could, would not be fooled by the usual tricks of concealment and misdirection. "We move again at dawn," Fierce Wolf continued. "We go to the high places, where horses cannot follow. We travel light, only what is necessary." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she understood the implications. Traveling light in Apache terms meant abandoning anything that could not be carried on foot over mountain terrain that would challenge even the most experienced warriors. It meant that the already inadequate food supplies would be cut to almost nothing. It meant that the weak would be left behind. The captives gathered that night in the small space they were allowed, sharing body warmth against the desert cold and whispered fears about what the morning would bring. "They'll abandon us," Mary said flatly. "We're just extra mouths to feed now, and they can't afford the luxury of keeping prisoners when they're running for their lives." Catherine began to cry softly, the sound barely audible but somehow more devastating than screams would have been. At 16, she had already lost everything once. The thought of facing death in this harsh landscape seemed to have broken something fundamental in her spirit. Elena took the girl's hand. "We don't know that," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe they'll kill us or leave us to die," Mary interrupted. "Those are the only practical options." Sarah listened to their despair and felt something harden inside her chest. Over the past weeks, she had watched these women find strength they didn't know they possessed, had seen them adapt to circumstances that would have broken many people. She refused to believe that their story would end with abandonment in a nameless canyon. "No," she said quietly, but with such certainty that the others turned to stare at her. "They won't." "How can you be so sure?" Mary demanded. Sarah thought about Grandmother Willow's words about acting bikego, according to one's deepest nature. She thought about the subtle changes in how the Apache women treated her, the way her actions had been observed and evaluated, the recognition that had grown from her willingness to sacrifice for others. "Because I won't let them," she said. Before the others could respond, Sarah stood and walked toward the center of the camp, where Fierce Wolf was conferring with the other war leaders. Her movement drew attention. Captives were not supposed to approach the leadership council uninvited, but she continued walking until she stood at the edge of their circle. "I need to speak with you," she said in English, then repeated the phrase in the few words of Apache she had managed to learn. Fierce Wolf looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight and something else, surprise perhaps, or curiosity about what could drive a captive to such a bold action. "You will speak?" he asked. "About tomorrow, about the journey into the mountains." Sarah kept her voice steady, though her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. "About the captives." A ripple of conversation ran through the assembled warriors. Some seemed angry at her presumption, others merely curious. But Fierce Wolf held up a hand for silence. "Speak," he said. Sarah took a breath, knowing that her next words would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of the 3 women who had become her responsibility, her family, her reason for finding strength when strength seemed impossible. "Don't abandon us," she said simply. "We can keep up, we can contribute, we can be assets, not burdens." "You are weak," one of the younger warriors interjected. "You slow us down. The army will follow whether you have captives or not," Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "But if you leave us here, you lose something more valuable than the weight we carry." "And what is that?" Fierce Wolf asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity. Sarah thought about everything she had observed over the past months. about the way the Apache valued courage and endurance, about the respect they showed for those who acted according to their deepest principles, even in the face of hardship. "You lose the chance to show that honor matters more than convenience," she said. "That protecting those who cannot protect themselves is what separates leaders from raiders. That acting with dignity, even toward enemies, is what makes a people worth preserving." The silence that followed her words stretched long enough for Sarah to doubt herself, to wonder if she had just sealed their death warrants with her presumption. But then Grandmother Willow's voice cut through the tension, speaking in rapid Apache that sounded like both rebuke and explanation. When she finished, Fierce Wolf studied Sarah for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. When he finally spoke, his words were addressed not just to her, but to the entire council. "The woman speaks truth," he said. "A people are judged not by how they treat their friends, but by how they treat their enemies. We are Apache. We do not abandon those under our protection, even when protection is difficult." He turned back to Sarah. "You say you can keep up. You say you can contribute. Tomorrow we will see if your words have strength behind them." As Sarah walked back to rejoin the other captives, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, measuring and evaluating. She had spoken boldly, had made promises she wasn't sure she could keep, but she had also done something more important. She had stood up not just for herself, but for the principle that all lives had value, that leadership meant accepting responsibility for the vulnerable. That night, as she shared her meager rations with Catherine, Elena, and Mary as she always did, Sarah Mackenzie understood that the real test was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring mountains that could kill, pursuit that could mean capture or death, and challenges that would push all of them beyond their limits. But tonight, under the desert stars, she had given 4 women, including herself, a chance to prove that survival was about more than just staying alive. It was about staying human in the face of inhumane circumstances, about finding strength not just for yourself, but for those who depended on you. Tomorrow would reveal whether her words had been wisdom or foolishness, but either way, she would face that revelation knowing she had acted according to her deepest nature, just as Grandmother Willow had taught her. The mountains were waiting. The ascent into the Chiricahua Mountains began before dawn, with the Apache moving like shadows through terrain that seemed designed to break the unwary. Sarah had imagined that her months of captivity had hardened her, but nothing had prepared her for the brutal reality of traveling Apache-style through country where a single misstep could mean death. The trail, if it could be called that, wound through boulder fields and razor-sharp outcroppings, across slides of loose shale that shifted treacherously underfoot, and up rock faces that required both hands and all the courage she could summon. The warriors moved with liquid grace, their moccasined feet finding purchase on surfaces that looked impossible to navigate. The women and children followed with only slightly less assurance, generations of mountain living evident in their easy familiarity with the vertical world. For the captives, every step was a negotiation with disaster. Catherine collapsed twice. In the first hour, her 16-year-old body simply folding under the combined weight of exhaustion, insufficient food, and the crushing physical demands of the climb. Each time Sarah helped her up, sharing what little strength remained in her own depleted frame. "I can't," Catherine whispered after the second fall, her face gray with desperation. "Sarah, I can't do this." "Yes, you can," Sarah replied, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Her own legs were shaking with the effort, and they hadn't even reached the serious climbing yet. "We go together, or we don't go at all." Elena was managing better, her youth and the resilience born of a hard life on the border serving her well. But Mary, tough as she was, had developed a rasping cough during the night that worsened with exertion. Each breath seemed to cost her, and Sarah could see the way she favored her left side, as if something internal had shifted or torn. By midday, when the sun turned the rock faces into furnaces that radiated heat like open ovens, they had fallen, nearly a quarter mile behind the main group. Sarah could see Fierce Wolf conferring with his lieutenants, gesturing back toward the stragglers with expressions that mixed impatience with calculation. She knew what they were discussing. The same arithmetic that governed all Apache decisions. How much risk was acceptable, how much energy could be expended on the weak, how long they could delay their escape before the pursuing cavalry closed the gap. The answer came when one of the young warriors jogged back down the trail to where Sarah was helping Catherine navigate a particularly treacherous stretch of loose stone. "Fierce Wolf says you have until the sun touches that peak," he said, pointing to a distant summit. "After that, the group moves without you." Sarah looked at the peak, estimated the distance they still had to cover, and felt her heart sink. At their current pace, they wouldn't make it even halfway. She looked at her fellow captives, Catherine barely able to stand, Mary gray-faced and struggling for breath, Elena trying to project strength she clearly didn't possess, and understood that her bold words of the previous night were about to be tested against the unforgiving reality of mountain warfare. "Then we'd better move faster," she said. What followed was the longest afternoon of Sarah Mackenzie's life. She bullied, cajoled, and physically supported her companions up slopes that seemed to climb toward heaven itself. When Catherine's legs gave out entirely, Sarah fashioned a makeshift harness from strips torn from her own skirt and helped pull the girl up the steepest sections. When Mary's cough became so severe that she couldn't catch her breath, Sarah found ways to create rest stops that looked like natural pauses rather than medical necessities. More importantly, she discovered reserves of leadership she hadn't known she possessed. "Elena, you take point," she directed when they reached a section where the trail split in 3 directions. "Your eyes are better than mine for reading sign. Catherine, you stay between Elena and me. I want to be able to reach you if you slip. Mary, you bring up the rear and call out if you need to stop." She found herself thinking not just about the next handhold or footstep, but about group dynamics, about how to distribute effort efficiently, about the psychological factors that could mean the difference between success and failure. When Catherine began to panic during a particularly exposed traverse, Sarah talked her through it with a calm authority that surprised them all. "Don't look down. Look at where you're going. That's it. Now move your left foot 6 inches to that little ledge. Yes, I can see it from here. Trust your feet. They're smarter than your fear." As the sun sank toward the designated peak, something remarkable began to happen. Other members of the Apache band, warriors, women, even some of the older children, began appearing at crucial points along the trail, not to help directly, which would have been seen as weakness, but to offer subtle guidance. A warrior might pause to adjust his pack in a way that showed the safest route around a dangerous section. A woman might stop to gather plants that just happened to mark the best handholds on a difficult climb. Most significantly, Grandmother Willow appeared at a section where the trail crossed a narrow ledge above a drop that seemed to fall away into forever. The old woman was sitting calmly on a boulder, as if she had been waiting there for hours, working on some intricate beadwork that required her complete attention. "Grandmother," Sarah panted as she reached the ledge, "we're falling behind. We are moving at exactly the pace you need to move," the old woman replied without looking up from her work. "A leader does not abandon her people to move faster. A leader finds ways to bring her people with her." Sarah stared at the word leader, feeling its weight settle around her shoulders like a mantle she hadn't known she was being fitted for. "I'm not." "You are what your actions make you," Grandmother Willow interrupted. "And your actions say, you understand something that many warriors never learn, that true strength is measured not by what you can do alone, but by what you can help others accomplish." The old woman stood, her beadwork disappearing into her clothing with practiced efficiency. "The sun has not yet touched the peak. You have time, but more importantly, you have shown that time is not the only measure of success." As if summoned by her words, Fierce Wolf appeared around a bend in the trail, moving down toward them with the easy stride of someone for whom vertical terrain held no terrors. Sarah's heart clenched, certain that he had come to deliver the ultimatum, to inform them that the group was moving on without the stragglers. Instead, he stopped in front of her, and studied her face with the same intensity she had seen him use when evaluating horses or weapons, looking for qualities that went deeper than surface appearance. "You have kept your word," he said simply. "All four still climb. All four still breathe. This is more than we expected." "We're not fast enough," Sarah replied, gesturing toward the distant peak where the sun continued its relentless descent. "We won't make the deadline." "The deadline has changed," Fierce Wolf said, and Sarah caught something in his voice that might have been approval. "We have found a place to camp where the cavalry cannot follow with horses. We can afford to wait." "Why?" Sarah asked, not daring to hope. Fierce Wolf glanced at Grandmother Willow, then back at Sarah. "Because a war leader asked me to. Because that same leader has proven that she values the lives of her people above her own comfort. Because the Apache respect those who act with honor, even when honor is difficult." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. War leader, applied to her, applied to a white woman, a former captive, someone who months ago had been hanging laundry in ignorance of the world she was about to enter. "I'm not Apache," she said weakly. "No," Fierce Wolf agreed. "But you understand what it means to be Apache better than some who were born to it. You understand that leadership is service, that power is responsibility, that a people are only as strong as their willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves." He turned to address Catherine, who was clinging to the rock face with the desperate grip of someone at the absolute limit of endurance. "Girl who fears heights," he said, using what Sarah realized was an Apache name. "Can you climb for one more hour?" Catherine's response was barely audible, but it was affirmative. "Woman who coughs like coyote," he said to Mary. "Can your lungs carry you to safety?" Mary straightened, finding reserves of dignity Sarah hadn't known she still possessed. "They can, if they must." "Sister who sings in Spanish," he said to Elena. "Will you help your companions reach the place of rest?" "Sí, jefe," Elena replied, unconsciously switching to Spanish in her intensity. "Yes, chief." Finally, he turned back to Sarah. "Woman who feeds others first," he said. And Sarah understood that this was her Apache name, earned through months of small actions that had been carefully observed and evaluated. "Will you lead your people to safety?" The question hung in the thin mountain air like a challenge and a recognition combined. Sarah looked at her companions, exhausted, frightened, pushed beyond their limits but still climbing, and understood that this moment had been inevitable from the first day she had chosen to share her rations. Leadership, she realized, was not something that was granted by authority or seized by ambition. It was something that grew quietly through countless small choices, through the daily decision to put others' needs before your own, through the willingness to take responsibility, not just for your own survival, but for the welfare of those who depended on you. "Yes," she said simply. The final hour of climbing tested every reserve of strength and will they possessed. The trail grew steeper, the handholds smaller, the exposure more terrifying. But something had changed in the group's dynamics. They moved now not as four separate individuals struggling to survive, but as a unit with Sarah at its center, making decisions, offering encouragement, finding solutions to problems that would have defeated any of them alone. When Catherine froze in terror on a narrow ledge, paralyzed by the sight of the drop below, Sarah didn't just talk her through it. She climbed up beside her, positioning her own body between the girl and the void, creating a barrier of human presence that made movement possible. When Mary's cough became so severe that she couldn't climb and breathe at the same time, Sarah organized rest stops that looked strategic rather than medical, giving the older woman time to recover without losing face. When Elena's strength finally gave out completely in the last 100 yards, Sarah and the others created a human chain that pulled her up the final vertical section through sheer collective will. As the sun finally touched the distant peak, the four women crested the ridge to find the Apache camp spread out in a hidden cirque that seemed carved from the living rock itself, protected on three sides by vertical walls and approachable only by the trail they had just conquered. It was a natural fortress that could have held off an army. The reception they received was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her months of captivity. Warriors who had previously ignored her existence nodded with what looked like respect. Women who had treated her as an unwelcome burden offered water and food without being asked. Children who had watched her with curious fear now approached with shy smiles. But the most significant moment came when Grandmother Willow approached their small group as they sat exhausted but triumphant around a small fire. "Tomorrow," the old woman said, "we hold council. There are decisions to be made about the path forward, about how we survive in a world that grows smaller every day." She paused, her ancient eyes reflecting firelight and something deeper. "You will sit with the war leaders. Your voice will be heard." Sarah stared at her, hardly able to process what she was hearing. "I'm a captive, I'm not—" "You are a leader," Grandmother Willow interrupted. "The Apache have spoken. You fed the captives before yourself. You brought the weak to safety when others would have abandoned them. You proved that your strength serves others, not just yourself." She smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features. "Among the Apache, this is what we call Nantan, war leader. It is not a title that is given. It is a recognition of what already exists." That night, as Sarah Mackenzie lay wrapped in her blanket under the brilliant canopy of mountain stars, she understood that her journey had come full circle. She had been taken from her old life as a captive, but she was being offered something entirely new. Not just survival, but purpose. Not just acceptance, but leadership. Not just a place among the Apache, but a voice in their future. The woman who had once hung laundry while humming hymns in the Arizona desert had discovered that leadership was not about commanding others, but about serving them. That strength was not about what you could accomplish alone, but about what you could help others achieve. That the highest honor was not to be followed, but to be trusted with the welfare of those too weak to protect themselves. In the morning, she would sit in council with Apache war leaders, helping to chart a course through an impossible world. But tonight she was simply Sarah, woman who feeds others first, listening to the desert wind carry the sound of her people's quiet breathing, knowing that she had found not just a place to survive, but a way to truly live. The Apache had called her a leader. More importantly, she had learned what that word really meant.